I talked to one of my husband's doctors who said that it's likely that your willingness to go along with him, to be patient around his behaviors, likely made the illness so much worse, because it was over a period of a decade that I saw him acting strangely, then it would improve, then he would be irate, but it would improve, then he would be unreliable and lie, but it would improve. And so every time that he seemed to be normal again, I would say to myself, well, we're not in crisis. All of those moments were moments where I actually could have interacted with him on a much more honest and revealing way to say, I am so concerned about you. We have to get help together. I heard from so many hundreds of women after I wrote my book who said, you just basically described my marriage. And I don't think that I'm alone in a willingness to try to normalize what's happening behind our closed doors.
Yeah.
So many of us see things that our partners are doing that are worries.
Welcome to the Dov Baron Show. Come for the stories, stay for the learning. Let me ask you, have we finally reached that moment in time where we've actually evolved enough to genuinely acknowledge that we've got to take care of our mental and emotional health? As the epidemic of loneliness keeps growing, along with terrifying numbers on suicide, will we keep telling ourselves and everyone else, I'm fine? F-I-N-E. I won't tell you what that acronym means right now, but later maybe. If you have skin, if you can breathe, there's a pretty good chance that you've been through some form of trauma. It happens. It's just part of life. Now, you may minimize it by saying, well, it's not as bad as Susie's was or as Fred's was. But the truth is that trauma in all of its forms always has an impact, and oftentimes a rather large lasting impact. Sometimes that impact is evident, and other times it's kind of hidden, and often it's hidden from the person living with it. They don't even know that they're operating out of that. But what can we do to be better custodians of our own mental and emotional health? This is the Dov Baron Show. This is where curiosity meets profound insights. You can tap into our community of deeply curious learners by hitting that subscribe button right now. This is not just another podcast, it's your passport to unparalleled insights. Every episode features the wisdom of global leaders, scientists, entertainers, philosophers, theologians, and journalists. Today, we're going to look at trauma. Yes, trauma. And just as importantly, what lies on the other side of trauma? Even if we don't know what the initials stand for, we've all heard PTSD. But what about PTSG? You've probably not heard of that. That's where we're going. It's about how to come back stronger from trauma. Our guest for the next two episodes is Sheila Hamilton. She is the host of a hugely popular podcast called Beyond Well, which I was honored and grateful to be part of. However, Sheila's story itself is an awakening for all of us. Sheila Hamilton is the author of 2 books and a 5-time Emmy award-winning journalist. Her company, Beyond Well Media, creates mental health content for WebMD and its millions of subscribers. Sheila was a popular morning show host and a journalist when her husband died by suicide, leaving her in debt and leaving her as the parent of a 9-year-old girl, all alone. She has gone on to transform her life and all the lives that she touches. Ladies and gentlemen, turn up the volume and help me welcome podcast host, media mogul, author of All the Things We Never Knew, and Chasing the Chaos of Mental Illness, Sheila Hamilton. Welcome, Sheila.
Dov, you give really good introduction. Thank you so much. That was beautiful.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. I'm really delighted to have you here. You and I spoke again, I think middle of last year. It was in this environment you're in right now. And I was like, oh, goodness, it looks lovely there. And definitely more so at this time of year. One of the places I always like to start the show is with the emotional source code of an individual. We talked a lot about emotional source code when I was on your show. I want to talk about your emotional source code because it's easy to look at you and see this beautiful woman who has done very well, who's gotten awards, who's been there, done that. But there's a journey. And that journey often starts way before we can conceive of. And often it's not the moment we think it is. So people talk about mine and they go, oh, it must be that moment that changed your life was when you fell off the mountain. It's like, yeah, That's what happened, but there's a whole bunch of stuff before that that led to that. That's what I'm always interested in, because I think that's where we don't get to go to. So tell us a little bit about where you come from that's going to give us context for where we're going.
Well, I'd like to say that where I am currently, Dev, is just kind of returning to the imaginative, creative 8-year-old who used to make up stories on the lawn of my parents' home and had so much hope and joy and optimism about the world. And I was not in that place for the longest time. I had to do almost 15 years worth of work to try to recover that person and that joy and that optimism after the death of my husband from suicide and the subsequent cancer diagnosis that my daughter had. I was in a decade-long journey to try to not become pessimistic, to try to not lose hope, to try to not become bitter and forlorn about my circumstances. And so my source code developed from that practice, from the practice of really saying, who are you going to be now? How do you let these events shape you, not in a way that becomes embittered, but a way that can actually allow you to grow? So I hope that's all right that I give 2 answers.
No, it is. Talk to us about that little girl you just talked about, the 8-year-old on your mom and dad's lawn. Is that the environment you come from? Was that a place where sort of dreams were fed, or was there other circumstances?
Well, so because I grew up in a really chaotic household, Dove, as I think you did, as some of our friends have, there was a lot of embitterment between my parents. There was a lot of drama that was going on that wasn't that healthy. And so I escaped to my stories. I had this incredible tree house out back, and I would go to this tree house or lie on the lawn and truly disappeared into storytelling, into where I was going to travel, into what I was going to do in my life. It was a real protective mechanism for me, but it was a place of obscene joy and so much creativity that I don't think back on my childhood as being this devastating, awful time. I think about me as being an incredibly capacious and I think really creative solution maker. I really see that girl as having tremendous resilience. And so as I was struggling as an adult and really devastated by the death of my husband, I worked to find that girl. I really tried to come back to her.
That to me is really interesting, because it takes us to where we sort of touched on in the introduction, that we've all been through some form of trauma, and we've all developed coping mechanisms. And the challenge with it is, I think, is that we don't call them coping mechanisms. We just call them, it's just the way I operate. And clearly your coping mechanism was to be in the treehouse or be on the lawn and be in that creative space to cope with the environment. I love what you say. You said it when we spoke last time. I love what you say about your coping mechanism is not bad or good. It's just your coping mechanism. The difference is whether it's a choice. And I think as a child, you knee-jerk into whatever you can. But as an adult, it's a different thing. Talk to us about that.
I see so many people that are trying very hard to deal with trauma. They're trying desperately to go to therapy or to learn techniques. Other people will deal with their trauma in a way that is completely subconscious. They're drinking too much. They're watching too much TV. They're having the kind of addictions that we know can make us all feel better about our lives, right? What I ask people is just to be conscientious about which choice you're making. Every single one of us are dealing with traumas. Every single one of us are finding coping methods. What I say is there's no right or wrong in what you're doing, but be mindful about those choices every single day. And Dov, I'll give you a really good example.
Please.
When my husband died, I was so out of it. I had to actually put sticky notes on my mirror, on my refrigerator, on my daughter's lunch pail, make her lunch, drink water, eat 3 times a day. I was so profoundly impacted by his death and the shock of his death that I wasn't even functioning at a human level.
No.
And then after that, I was like, how long can I do this? And so thank God I'm an investigative reporter because I just went into my research. What are the techniques to recover from PTSD? What makes resilience in human beings? Who are the great writers about resilience and how can we learn from them? And I made it a mission to try to bring that woman who was stumbling around her house, unable to focus or give or even feel. I made it my mission to turn on my reporter brain and try to learn how to be a resilient human being. It's the first time in my life I didn't even know what resilience really meant. And I had to teach myself in the depth of trauma to try to figure out how to be a more resilient human.
Well, you and I talked a little about this when I was on your show, which is the trap of resilience. And what I mean by the trap of resilience is that a lot of times people think being resilient is building a wall that's so thick. They still function, but all the shit still going on inside of their head and inside of their emotional body, as opposed to PTSD, which is post-traumatic growth, or anti-fragility, which is what I believe you're talking about. Talk to us about the distinction, because I think it's important for people to get that this is not about soldiering on.
No.
This is about something else altogether.
Dov, your point is so well taken that I absolutely saw trauma as being kind of a pivotal moment for change for me.
Mm-hmm.
I had been sort of flitting along on the surface, doing good work, getting accolades, being part of my community, and never really stopped to consider how is it that you can, in the very worst of circumstances, still be optimistic, still give to people, still have the kind of forward momentum. So the body of work that I started learning about post-traumatic growth came out of Stanford. Those are the people that I went to learn about it. And it says that you acknowledge the trauma, that you actually understand its impact on your body and your nervous system, that you accept what has happened, and that then you move forward to the next question of, now what are we going to do next? And to me, that was such an eye-opening thing, because when you're in trauma, your nervous system is so overloaded that it's almost like every sensory experience is asking us not to look to your goals, not to look to what you want to do next, not to look for who do you care about and who do you love. And so post-traumatic growth says, no, we're going to use this pivotal moment as a way to catapult you into the next stage of development of your life. And that's absolutely what I went through.
And I think that some people feel like it's betrayal. To look forward is a betrayal of the trauma, betrayal of the grief that I feel because, in your case, that I lost my husband, or the grief of this happened, that somehow I'm brushing it off. And again, I really want to reiterate what Sheila's saying here. It's not about jumping over that. It is about understanding that that's not the end. And we feel like grief is the end naturally, and that's okay and it's understandable. But it's also not jumping over the grief to say, well, what's next? Which is, I think, is a lot of the American mentality of the hustle idea is, well, just pick yourself up by your bootstraps and get on with it. Well, everybody gets knocked down and get up again. Well, if you get knocked down 7 times and you get up 8, you're an idiot. Get knocked down once, stay on your ass and work out why you're there, feel what you need to feel, learn what you need to learn so that you can get up, being stronger, having grown and having become anti-fragile. And that's a big distinction.
I have thought about those stages of grief that were absolutely necessary to pass through before I could move on to post-traumatic growth. And one of the tenets that I will add to the denial and shock and freeze, everything else is out there in modern literature, is I had to forgive my husband. I had to forgive him for his choice, for its impact on our family, and for not recognizing the level of despair and dysfunction that he was at before he claimed his own life. And honestly, Dov, I think if I hadn't gone through that forgiveness stage, I might never have been able to move on to a new stage of growth. Never. Because I felt so angry inside, and I wasn't even capable of acknowledging my anger until I touched on forgiveness. It was super interesting.
I want to call that from that and just put a pause in there because that's important. People jump to the forgiveness and they forget the anger.
That's right.
Or they get stuck in the anger and they never get to forgiveness. And what you're doing here is really important, is bringing those two things together. You can't get to real forgiveness unless you really allow yourself to be totally pissed off about what happened.
Yeah.
But if you stay stuck there, you'll never get to forgiveness for yourself or the other person.
Yeah. You know, I watched my daughter's grief, which I think kids do grief way more naturally than adults. They don't have expectation around it. And she would wail like you see women who are over their children wailing. She would throw herself on her bed and pound her pillow and cry. And she would be so angry at her dad. And then she would get up and she would wipe her eyes and she would say, I have an art project due at school and I want to do it. In watching her unedited expression of grief, I actually had the example for how we as adults can move to post-traumatic growth. We can feel our feelings. We can have the emotions and the sadness, and I think the betrayal that one feels when a person we love leaves us in our lives. And then we can move to now, what's next for us? And honestly, if I hadn't had her as such an enormously insightful teacher, I might never have gotten to where I've been.
How beautiful. What a gift that somebody could demonstrate for you. More than an example, actual demonstration of letting yourself be with what comes up. Because a lot of the times we as adults talk ourselves out of it. Well, I should be over this by now, or I should be this, or it should be in stage 2 instead of stage 3, as opposed to, no, you should feel whatever the hell you're feeling in this moment and then be done with it. I had a Buddhist teacher for many years, and he said, Western Buddhists get on my nerves. He was a Western Buddhist, by the way. So he was born in Northern England, and I met him in Asia, and I was a student of his for many, many years. And he said, Western Buddhists get on my nerves. Okay, well, tell me why. And he goes, because you think it's about denial. Because Buddhism is not about denial. Buddhism is, and these are his words, if you kick me in the nuts, I will cry and I will fall to my knees. But I won't carry that around as a resentment for the next 6 weeks. He goes, you guys pretend it didn't hurt, but carry it around for 6 weeks. That's the difference. One looks Buddhist, but isn't, and one is Buddhist, but doesn't look like it from the Western perspective. And I think that that's very much what you just demonstrated so beautifully with your daughter, is that I'm in grief and I'm pissed off and I'm sad and I'm wailing. And now, okay, now it's time for the art project.
Yeah.
Fantastic. What a gift.
It was a gift. And, you know, I've looked at a lot of long-range studies, Dov, because I was torn between wanting to throw my daughter into grief therapy and a psychologist. And what I saw in most of the research is that kids who've had trauma do as well as kids who are focused in intense grief therapy if they are A, with a supportive parent who still loves them and can help them achieve their dreams, and B, they have something to look forward to. It's such an important part of the circle of trauma that we aren't really talking about. And even with Oprah's phenomenal book with Bruce Perry, who I have so much respect for on trauma, there is too much of an emphasis, I believe, in how we stay stuck in our trauma, in how we want to blame it, how we want to excuse what we haven't done because of it, how we want to have people acknowledging our trauma again and again and again, whereas I see it much more like I saw my daughter's process. It is there. It is potent. It is powerful. Pay attention, but be brave enough to move on.
Be with it until it's done and let yourself move past it. You have no obligation to it. Yeah, that's powerful.
Yeah.
Now, you know, you talked about your husband's suicide, David, right? Is that correct?
Yes.
And you also talked about the lack of awareness. You talked about your own lack of awareness about what was going on. One of the things I talked about at the beginning was that oftentimes people are traumatized and they don't know that their behavior is a response to trauma. Do you think he lacked awareness, or was it just you, or was he aware but hiding it?
He came from a family that very much thought that mental illness was a weakness and that he should not discuss it. He should not seek help. His family really had strong opinions about people being weak who were mentally ill. And so even if he did know, he would never have shared it because he was so ashamed of it.
What would you say to the person watching us, listening to us, who has a sense that their partner is in a similar place, maybe not bipolar, but maybe some other mental issue, who won't talk about it because of the shame they've been indoctrinated with?
I have so many things to say. I talked to one of my husband's doctors who said that it's likely that your willingness to go along with him, to be patient around his behaviors, likely made the illness so much worse, because it was over a period of a decade that I saw him acting strangely, then it would improve, then he would be irate, but it would improve, then he would be unreliable and lie, but it would improve. And so every time that he seemed to be normal again, I would say to myself, well, we're not in crisis. All of those moments were moments where I actually could have interacted with him on a much more honest and revealing way to say, I am so concerned about you. We have to get help together. I heard from so many hundreds of women after I wrote my book who said, you just basically described my marriage. And I don't think that I'm alone in a willingness to try to normalize what's happening behind our closed doors.
Yeah.
So many of us see things that our partners are doing that are worrisome. They might be drinking too much, or they might be sleeping too much, or they might be sex addicted, or for whatever reason, we don't want to bring it to a head because it's shameful, both to us, it's shameful to them, it's difficult. But all those years I waited and didn't force a kind of come to Jesus moment with him, likely made his illness that much worse.
So I think that this is really important, because I think that many of us walk around with the equation, the psychological equation, that denial is love. Denial is not love.
Yeah.
If your partner is, or yourself for that matter, is going through something and you go, well, they're not usually like this, even though you actually know that this is a pattern, you are throwing wood on the fire. You're really not helping. And you may go, well, I don't want to risk my marriage. You don't think this is risking your marriage? I think it is hard. I get it. I'm not saying, no judgment on anybody. I understand that it's very difficult to confront. And, I very much believe in intervention. And I'm not just talking about for alcohol. I'm talking about for whatever it might be. And people sitting around and going, listen, Bob, Susie, whatever your name is, I love you. We love you. And we can see that this is a pattern. Even if that person denies it, you've planted the seed.
Absolutely.
If 6 people out of my family, including a couple of my really close friends, says I'm behaving in a really fucked up way, I might want to think about that. I can't deny it anymore.
Yeah. And Dev, you just make such a good point. For a lot of women, I think that trying to keep a family together is their number one priority. For me, it absolutely was. I wanted my daughter to grow up with a father. I wanted her to have someone who came home every night and rushed to greet her and kissed her. He was a fabulous father. He was very, very sick. And because my love for my daughter superseded my willingness to actually accept reality, I contributed to her being fatherless.
Wow. Let me pause you, please. Could you say that again? Because I think you punched that in the nose. That is so important.
I would love to. I may cry.
That's okay.
Because, Dov, I have had to come to grips with my part in our family's story. And that is one of the most difficult parts of it for me. That my love for my daughter, my protection for her, my want for her to grow up with a father in the home actually contributed to her being fatherless, because I was in denial about so much of his behavior. I think that this is, once again, part of the traumatic experience, is coming to grips with our part in almost every relationship we have. I was focused on her love, her normality, her future. And because I was denying the entire experience of what was happening both for him and for me in the household, it really did contribute to her now being without a father. And I have to live with that. So these are the stakes that we have as human beings when we failed to actually live in a reality. I've often thought about that because mental illness in my husband's circumstance didn't show up consistently, and it didn't show up with every single flag that said to me, yes, he's mentally ill. Because sometimes he was incredibly productive. Other times he couldn't get out of bed. Sometimes he was the life of the party. Other times he refused to show up at the party after saying we were going to host it. The behavior was so erratic and so difficult for me to get my arms around. I couldn't tell what was healthy and what was unhealthy. That's how sick I'd become. It is a very, very confusing illness to be a part of because it is not just one thing.
You just said something else that's profound and important for people to understand, is that you may not be able to, in a germ sense, catch mental illness, but environmentally you catch mental illness. And by minimizing and denying certain behaviors and coping, again, part of that coping thing, working around them that in such a way that you become not as mentally healthy as you should be, which makes their behavior more and more acceptable, and you keep more and more contorting into this mental emotional pretzel.
That's right.
So I think it's a really important point you just made there, Sheila, is that your sort of working around it becomes a new form of mental illness that now when you're in grief, you actually have to undo that shit as well as everything else.
Yeah. And ask yourself, how far detached from your own emotional well-being does one become before they say, I'm not sleeping, I'm not eating well, I'm not able to plan any holidays or events with this person because they're so unreliable. I don't feel nurtured. I don't feel loved. I was so focused on keeping my house together, keeping my job, keeping my daughter healthy. So many balls in the air that I had really left my own emotional landscape to be deserted. And it's part of what has been so beautiful to come back to, Dov, is to feel alive again, to be able to cry.
Yeah.
I had many, many years after my late husband died where I was so in shock and so bereft, I couldn't form tears because I was so completely drained of emotion and so unable to access it. And so in some ways it feels like coming home, yes, both to the joy of that 8-year-old girl, but also coming back to the ability to feel again, to feel sadness, to feel empathy, to feel humiliation, anger, all of the emotions have finally come back home, which I'm really happy about.
Yeah, I think that we societally are conditioned to be in pursuit of happiness. I understand that, of course. At a human level, we need to be in pursuit of our whole emotional self, which means watch a movie and have a cry, watch a movie and have a laugh, sit with your friends and feel melancholy or feel excited, or the full plethora of feelings that are available to us as humans. And I think that a lot of the time we are hungry, tired, or horny because angry's not allowed or sad's not allowed. And there's so many other feelings. When people talk about therapy, I always say that therapy's not about making you happy.
Mm-hmm.
Therapy's about giving you access to the whole plethora of your emotions.
Yeah.
The healthier you get, the more appropriate they are, meaning you're not having a 10 response to a 2 thing. You're having a 2 response to a 2 thing because this is proportionate. I love what you're saying about this. This is why I think that the whole message around PTSD about post-traumatic growth is so important, is because, as you and I talked about with mine, it's the opportunity to come back to your whole self, that this shitty, horrible, devastating moment is the catalyst. Nobody wants to see their child throw themselves on the bed and have a wailing breakdown. Nobody wants that for that kid.
Yeah.
But this is the catalytic wake up for you and for her. I would guess you wouldn't deny yourself that.
No, that's one of the hardest things, is that I feel like my growth was exponential. My daughter, the human she became, I'm not even certain if that could have been her path, if not for enduring that loss. She is the most prescient person I've ever known. And she is so there for you in every moment, which I don't think was her personality before she lost her dad. And so the gifts of what we've been able to make from something that could have been, like I said, embittering, and it could have left us in a state where we always felt victimized. And instead, I think both of us are pretty nice people.
That's awesome. We're already at the end of part one of the show. I want to talk about the other side of it. I want to talk more about the growth, about the things that people can do, how they can move forward, what it takes, etc., to have that level of growth that we've been talking about. But before we end part one of the show, I want to make sure that people can find out more about you, all your wonderful resources, your podcasts, your books, etc. Please tell people where they can find out more about you.
Yeah, you can just go to SheilaHamilton.com. It gets to the business part that I have created a small business to provide this kind of mental health content, along with 5 incredible psychologists and psychiatrists at SheilaHamilton.com. And I also have 2 books out right now, All the Things We Never Knew, and also a new book. My joy project is Palm Springs, and it's an Asaline book, phenomenal publisher, talking about the health and wellness and beauty of Palm Springs.
Beautiful. Well, of course, we'll make sure that we post all the links to those, including the social links for you to get a hold of Sheila and reach out and use the resources. They'll all be in the show notes. So if you didn't catch them, don't worry. We're going to be back in just one click for more of our delicious conversation with Sheila Hamilton. So stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.